Paul Revere and the American Revolution by Patricia West. Paul Revere had a secret. He spent some of his time working as a skillful craftsman, making and repairing all kinds of metal household items. He also worked as a sort of dentist, replacing people's missing teeth with animal teeth. But it was Revere's somewhat secret third role as a member of the Boston Sons of Liberty that won him a place in United States history. Sons of Liberty. Paul Revere became famous for the part he played in the Boston Sons of Liberty. This group met often to discuss their complaints about the British, whose king, King George III, ruled 13 colonies along the east coast of what is today the United States. The meetings sometimes took place under an elm tree the group called a Liberty Tree. Nearly every town in colonial America had its own Liberty Tree, where colonists gathered for anti-British activities. Colonists posted their complaints about British rule on its branches. Towns that did not have a suitable tree put up a Liberty pole instead. Revere had once been a soldier who fought for the British. He was among the colonists who battled the French and their Native American allies during the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. In that conflict, the French lost the land they held west of the Mississippi River. The British knew that this territory would be too expensive to defend, so they made a law that prevented the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. This law made the colonists angry, because many wanted to move westward from the 13 colonies. King George III was the ruler of Britain, the 13 American colonies, and other British colonies around the world. He ruled from 1760 to 1820, longer than any other British king. The British were angry too, but for a different reason. The war had put them deeply in debt. They thought the colonists should help pay for the cost of the war. After all, the war had been fought partly to protect the colonies, but the colonists did not share this view. The British also wanted the colonists to help pay for the costs of defense and government. This demand was no more popular than the first one. The British went ahead and taxed the colonies anyway. One law, passed in 1764, was called the Sugar Act. It taxed sugar, molasses, and other products shipped to the colonies. Colonists who ignored the act were punished as smugglers. A year later, the Stamp Act was passed by the British. This law required all legal and business documents in the colonies to carry a stamp showing that a tax had been paid. Even newspapers had to have this special stamp. The colonists were very angry. They wondered what tax the British would decide on next. Would the British try to tax everything the colonists owned? It didn't seem fair because the colonists had no voice in the British government. They claimed the British were taxing them without representation. The British government sold stamps that were required for many documents, including newspapers. Colonists expressed their anger by burning stamped papers. They also placed a skull and crossbones image on documents that required a British stamp. The colonists' boycott. The main purpose of the Boston Sons of Liberty was to protest these British decisions. Many of the colonists joined together to boycott or refused to buy any British goods. British merchants, seeing that their businesses would be hurt by the boycott, thought the act was a mistake. Even some British politicians agreed with the colonists, and the act was soon cancelled. Then the British government came up with another way of raising money from the colonists. The Townshend Acts taxed goods that were brought into the colonies. Colonists would have to pay taxes when they bought imported items, such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. To make sure the taxes were paid, British soldiers had the right to search colonists' businesses and homes. In response to these actions, another boycott of British goods was called for by Samuel Adams, another member of the Boston Sons of Liberty. Although women didn't have much voice in politics in those days, some of them formed a group called Daughters of Liberty. By refusing to buy British goods, these women made the hard work in their homes even more difficult. They had to make the items needed by their families themselves. Leaders in the colonies encouraged peaceful protests. However, people couldn't always stay calm while British troops were seizing their goods. When Britain threatened to send more soldiers, Samuel Adams declared, "We will destroy every soldier that dares put his foot on shore." Another 1,000 soldiers landed in Boston in 1768 anyway. Tensions increased between the soldiers and the colonists. Both sides lost their manners. The soldiers bumped Bostonians off the sidewalk and disrupted the colonists' church services with loud music. Younger colonists yelled insults at the soldiers and called them lobsters. That rude name arose because of the bright red coats the British soldiers wore. A British soldier. The tall, heavy hat had to be fastened to the soldier's hair, or it would fall off. The musket needed reloading after each shot. The bright red wool coat shrank in the rain and made movement difficult. White pants were hard to keep clean. Square-toed shoes were identical. There was no difference between the left and right shoes. Trouble in the snow. Arguments between British soldiers and colonists got worse and worse. They finally turned violent on March 5, 1770. On that date, bystanders watched British troops tread the streets of Boston. Colonists threw a few snowballs and even stones. Angry words were shouted. In all the confusion, a British soldier thought he heard his captain yell fire. Before the captain could stop his men, they fired, and 5 Bostonians lay dead. Among them was an African-American sailor named Crispus Attucks. He was the first person to die in what would become the American Revolution. Colonists react. Paul Revere used his talent to let people in all the colonies know about this shocking event, which became known as the Boston Massacre. He made an engraving of the shooting, and many people saw it. Revere's engraving was not quite accurate, however. His picture made it look as though the British attacked the colonists on purpose. In reality, the soldiers may have fired because they were frightened and confused. John Adams was a patriot, but he defended the British soldiers in their trial after the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was followed by a trial of the British soldiers. The question was whether the British captain had ordered his soldiers to fire. 2 witnesses claimed that the order came from a person in dark-colored clothing who stood behind the troops. The jury decided that most of the British soldiers had acted in self-defense. By coincidence, the British government had decided to cancel most of the Townshend Acts on the day of the massacre. Of course, the colonists did not know that at the time, and they became angry again when Britain enacted the Tea Act in 1773. Tea was a very popular drink in the colonies. About 6 million pounds of tea leaves were used every year. Under the Tea Act, only British tea could be bought in the colonies. The colonists boycotted tea right away, and it was never as popular in the colonies again. The people of Boston did more than just boycott tea. Paul Revere and other members of the Boston Sons of Liberty planned a fearless and bold attack. They dressed up as Mohawk Indians so they wouldn't be recognized. "Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight," they cried. In the middle of the night, they crept onto the British ships that were carrying tea. They broke open more than 300 tea chests and dumped the tea into the harbor. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. Revere decided to saddle a steed and carry the news of the Boston Tea Party to the Sons of Liberty in New York and Philadelphia. In both cities, the colonists promised to support Boston on the question of the tea tax. It was not to be the last of Revere's rides as a messenger. Britain responded to the Boston Tea Party with magnified anger, and with yet another set of acts. The colonists gave their own name to these acts, the Intolerable Acts. They printed them in their newspapers, surrounded with a thick black border, making them look like a death announcement. Some colonists set copies of the acts on fire. After the Boston Tea Party, the British wanted to punish Boston, so they closed its port. They threatened to keep it closed until the colonists paid for the tea they had ruined. Readying for war. The colonies decided that it was time to stand together against Britain and King George. In 1774, they held a meeting in Philadelphia called the First Continental Congress. They decided to stop trade with Britain until the intolerable acts were lifted. The colonists hoped that this action would force Britain to do so. However, each colony began training its own troops in case the British refused. Blacksmiths were busy making weapons. Other workers produced gunpowder and other supplies. Militias were formed to protect towns. About 1/4 of the militiamen were chosen to be Minutemen. These soldiers were usually less than 25 years old and picked for their strength. They got their name because they were supposed to be ready for battle at a minute's notice. A colonial militiaman. Ordinary clothes were worn because the militia had no uniform. The musket was often the militiaman's own hunting weapon. To the brink of war. In the streets of Boston, Revere and the other Sons of Liberty were watching and listening closely. There were 4,000 British soldiers in the town, so there were many chances to overhear British plans. Britain had its own spies. These spies were colonists who remained loyal to Britain and were therefore called loyalists. Colonists who wanted freedom from Britain were called patriots. Through spies, British General Gage learned that the colonists were storing war supplies in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. Revere was keeping a careful eye on General Gage's ships in Boston Harbor. He thought that the British might have plans for Concord. The only question was this: would the British start for Concord by land or by sea? One way to get there was to row across the Charles River to Charlestown, and then march inland. The other route was a 21-mile hike over a narrow piece of land that connected Boston to the mainland. The land route would take more time. Revere prepared for the British to move either way. Revere's midnight ride. Revere set up a way to signal the colonists on the shore opposite Boston. They were to watch for a glimmer of light in the tall steeple of Old North Church. A single lantern would mean that the British troops were coming by land. 2 lanterns meant they would arrive by sea. Late on the night of April 18, 1775, Revere had 2 friends row him across the Charles River. On the other side, he got on a borrowed horse, probably named Brown Beauty, and rode toward Lexington, a town near Concord. His job at that town was to warn his friends, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, to leave. Revere knew that the British would arrest these men if they found them. After speaking with Adams and Hancock, Revere met up with another messenger, William Dawes. The pair took off for Concord and was joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott. Prescott was returning to Concord after visiting a friend and was not originally part of Revere's plan. But when Prescott heard about the mission to warn Concord, he offered to help. Suddenly, British horsemen surrounded the 3 messengers. The soldiers threatened them and told them not to move. Prescott and Dawes managed to get away. Only Revere was captured. He told the British that he'd already warned the entire countryside and that 500 militiamen waited at Lexington for battle. The British believed Revere and let him go, but they kept his horse and gave him one that was too tired to be of much help to him. The battle at Lexington. Finally, several hundred British troops reached Lexington and found only 77 somber militiamen. The British commander instructed his men, "Soldiers, don't fire. Keep your ranks. Form and surround them." Just as in Boston, a shot rang out from somewhere. No one knows for certain where, and soon several militiamen lay dead. The British were moving around in confusion. Their officers couldn't get them organized. Then one major took control and found a drummer. The drum's beat got their attention, and they continued on to Concord, and into trouble. On to Concord. Warned earlier by Prescott, a few hundred Minutemen had turned out to face the British in Concord. The Minutemen took a position on a hill. From there they could see their flag flying from the town's Liberty Pole. They tried to summon their courage for the coming battle. The British gathered on Concord's North Bridge. Some of the soldiers began tearing up the bridge's wooden planks. That sight made the Minutemen very angry. They began to move toward the bridge. Their spirits rose when a flute began to play a march that everyone knew the British hated. Seeing their enemy moving forward, the British were amazed. They never imagined that the colonists would actually dare to march against them. Then the shooting began. Minutemen took special aim at British officers, who stood out from their troops. The British soldiers retreated to Boston. 4,000 militiamen lined the road from Concord to Lexington and shot at the British in a tag-team ambush. The shot heard round the world. The Revolutionary War had now begun. No one could predict the fate of the colonies. Would they win their freedom, or would they remain under British control? There were many more battles to come on the way to American independence. As poet Ralph Waldo Emerson later wrote, the shots fired at Lexington and Concord were heard round the world. One could say that the sound lingers whenever people seek their freedom. Glossary. Fate. Noun. Things that will happen to people that cannot be controlled. Fearless. Adjective. Brave. Without fear. Glimmer. Noun. A faint, unsteady light. Lingers. Verb. Stays. Magnified. Adjective. Increased. Somber. Adjective. Serious. Steed. Noun. A lively horse. Reader response. 1. Here are some made-up newspaper headlines about the events in this book. In what order might they have been printed? Place them in the correct order using a chart like the one below. 2. Do you have questions that were not answered by this selection? Where could you look for the answers? 3. Think about the words in the glossary and their meanings. Write a paragraph using the 7 words. Remember that a paragraph has one main idea and details that tell about the idea. Your paragraph may be serious or silly. 4. What can you learn about a British soldier's uniform from the call-outs on page 10?